Hey guys, it's good to see you here again. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating, knowing that somewhere far away, someone might be falling asleep to the sound of an old story from the north. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a little. Because tonight, we'll go back, far, far back, to a time when winter wasn't just a season, but a test of will. A time when the world was frozen solid, and life depended on what you had stored, smoked, or salted away. The question that always lingers is, what did the Vikings really eat to survive those endless winters? The answer is not simple, and not just about food. It's about patience, courage, and a strange kind of beauty that lived among the frost and fire. My name is Einar. Long ago, I lived by the edge of a northern fjord, a small settlement that the sea loved and punished in equal measure. In the summer, the days stretched endlessly, and the sun never truly disappeared. But in winter, everything changed. The light faded, the air thickened with ice, and silence grew heavy on our shoulders. The sea froze near the shore, and even the birds left us behind. In those months, food became something sacred. Every bite was a reminder of our labor, of hunts, of nets cast in the freezing surf, of hands cracked from the salt and wind. When I close my eyes, I can still smell the smoke from the longhouse, the scent of dried fish hanging above the fire, the faint sweetness of burning pine, and the sound of the storm whispering through the roof beams. You see, the Vikings didn't eat like kings, even if they dreamed like them. Most days, we ate what the land would give, and what the sea wouldn't take back. We hunted, fished, foraged, and preserved everything we could. When autumn came, it was a race, a desperate gathering before the snow closed the mountain paths. Men went out to hunt elk and deer, their breath turning to mist in the cold dawn. Women worked the fires, salting meat, boiling broth, drying herbs that would bring warmth to the bones months later. There was no room for waste. Not a scrap. The fat from an animal could keep a lamp burning through the darkest night. Bones became broth, sinew became thread, and hides became the walls that held the warmth inside. We didn't just eat to live. We built our world from what we ate. I remember one particular autumn, the last before my first voyage across the sea. The harvest was small that year. The winds had come early, and the rains had ruined much of the barley. But we had fish. Oh yes, the fjord was generous then. The men brought in barrels of cod and herring, and we worked for days, slicing, salting, and hanging them to dry. By the time the first snow fell, the longhouse smelled of smoke and salt, and we felt ready. Or so we thought. Winter doesn't arrive in one night. It sneaks in like a thief. First, the frost at dawn. Then the rivers turn slow, and the air grows still. The old ones could always tell when it was coming. They'd say the world gets too quiet, even the crows know when to stop talking. By the time the real cold came, the sun rose for only a few hours a day. Inside the longhouse, the air was thick with heat and the low hum of people breathing in unison. We slept, talked, and ate in that single smoky room. The walls would sweat when the fire was too strong, and freeze again by morning. Our meals were simple: dried fish soaked in broth, chunks of meat boiled with whatever roots we'd managed to save. Sometimes, when someone brought out a piece of bread made from barley and oats, it felt like a gift from the gods. But food was never just food. It was memory, it was safety, it was story. Each meal carried with it the echo of summer, of green fields, of laughter, of the days when the world felt alive. And so we chewed slowly, we swallowed carefully, because we knew that each bite was a small act of defiance against the endless dark. You might think of Vikings as fierce warriors, swinging axes, sailing longships, shouting into storms. And that's true in a way. But the real strength was in the quiet moments, the patience it took to wait out the blizzard, the will to share your last piece of smoked meat with a hungry neighbor. That was the kind of courage winter demanded. I remember my mother saying once, as she stirred a pot of fish stew, "The gods gave us hunger so we'd remember we're alive." And she was right. Even now, I can see her face glowing in the firelight, her hands steady, her eyes watching the pot as if guarding a treasure. She could make a meal out of almost nothing, a handful of fish bones, a piece of seaweed, a few herbs dried from the summer. And somehow, it tasted like home. Those were the beginnings of my lessons. Lessons about survival, about gratitude, about the strange beauty in scarcity. I didn't know it then, but food would become a map of my life. Every journey, every storm, every feast and famine would leave its flavor in my memory. So, as the wind howled outside the longhouse that first winter, and I sat by the fire, listening to the old men tell stories of gods and giants, I began to understand something simple and eternal. That to live through a northern winter was not a battle, but a rhythm, a slow, steady dance between hunger and hope. And that dance always began with the same thing, the first hunt of the season. The first snow came softly that year, a thin blanket over the moss and stone. It looked gentle at first, but we knew better. Snow was a promise, and not a kind one. When it touched the ground, it whispered that time was running out. There were still traps to check, meat to salt, fish to smoke, wood to cut, and every delay could mean hunger later. I was 16 when my father told me I was ready to join the hunters. That morning, the sky was the color of old iron. The air smelled of pine and frost, and every breath felt sharp in my chest. We rose before dawn, wrapped in furs, silent except for the sound of boots crunching in the snow. The longhouse behind us glowed faintly through the mist, a warm world fading as we walked into the cold. The forest was alive with quiet. It's strange, but in the deep cold, every sound becomes sharper, the crack of a branch, the faint rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. We carried bows, spears, and small sacks of dried fish for the journey. My father led the way, his movements slow and deliberate, his breath steady. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words stayed in my mind. "Don't hunt for glory," he said. "Hunt for the hearth. Every life you take feeds another. Respect that." We followed the animal tracks through a narrow valley where the wind never rested. Sometimes the snow came sideways, biting into our faces. We found signs of elk, large prints, deep and fresh, and moved carefully, keeping downwind. Hours passed, and my fingers grew numb, but I didn't complain. No one complained in winter. Complaints were for the rich, and we were just people who needed to eat. By midday, we spotted the herd. 3 elk stood near a frozen stream, their breath rising in small clouds. My father motioned for silence. I could hear my own heartbeat, the world narrowing to that single sound. When I raised my bow, my hands shook, not from fear, but from cold and awe. To stand there, facing a creature that could feed your entire family, was like standing before a god. The arrow flew true. The elk stumbled, then fell, its body heavy against the snow. The silence after the shot was immense. Not joy, not triumph, but something humbler. We knelt beside the animal, touching its fur, thanking it softly. My father whispered an old prayer, a few words in the tongue his father had taught him. He said the land listens, and if you speak to it with respect, it will answer in kindness. We butchered the elk right there, working fast before the cold stiffened the flesh. Steam rose from the warm body, and the smell of blood filled the air. It was not a pleasant scent, but it meant survival. The meat was wrapped in layers of hide, the fat stored separately for lamps and cooking. Even the bones would go home, to be boiled for broth, or carved into tools. Nothing, not even the smallest scrap, would be wasted. When we returned to the village, the women met us by the smokehouse. They worked without words, salting and hanging the meat on wooden racks near the fire. The smoke would curl around the flesh for days, blackening it, sealing it against the damp. In the corner, my mother was boiling broth with herbs, juniper, garlic, a little salt. The smell drifted through the longhouse, rich and sharp. That night, we ate together, and the warmth of the stew spread through us like sunlight. I learned something important that day, that food in the North was never just taken. It was earned, fought for, prayed over. Every bite carried the memory of effort. And somehow, that made it taste deeper, truer. As the days passed, the snow thickened, and hunting grew harder. Sometimes we'd return empty-handed, the forest too still, the animals gone deeper into the mountains. When that happened, we turned to the sea. Men chipped holes through the ice to fish, lowering lines baited with bits of meat or shellfish. Some nights, they'd come home with cod, other nights, with nothing but frostbitten hands. But even on those nights, there was always a meal, thin stew, dried fish, maybe a crust of bread. You see, in the long winter, food was not about taste, it was about rhythm. Eat too much, and the stores wouldn't last. Eat too little, and strength would fade. So we measured our hunger carefully, counting days and portions, making sure the children always ate first. The elders often gave away their share, saying they'd already had enough of life's feast. It was a quiet, noble kind of sacrifice that no one ever spoke of aloud. Sometimes, during the longest nights, when the snow pressed heavy on the roof, we'd gather around the hearth and listen to the hunters' stories. They'd talk about the ones that got away, the bear that vanished into the mist, the fox that led them in circles, the stag that disappeared like smoke. Each story ended with laughter, but there was always something else behind it, a shared understanding that the wild was older and wiser than any man. I still remember one tale from that winter. A hunter named Bjorn claimed he saw lights in the forest, pale blue flames hovering above the snow. He said they were the souls of lost hunters, guiding the living back home. No one argued with him. Out there, in the endless dark, you learned not to question the strange things that the cold revealed. When the moon rose full, my father said the forest would soon rest. The animals would burrow deep, the rivers would freeze solid, and the hunt would end for the season. That meant one thing: it was time to turn to the sea, our oldest friend and greatest enemy. Because when the land sleeps, the water still moves beneath the ice. And for those who dared to fish the winter waves, the ocean would sometimes reward them. With cod, with herring, and sometimes with something far stranger. When the forests finally fell silent and no hoofprint marked the snow, our eyes turned to the sea. It was never truly still. Even in the deepest winter, when the shore was locked in ice, the waves far out remained alive, dark breathing, whispering under the frozen skin. The ocean was a cruel friend, but it had fed us since before memory. And so, when the last elk vanished into the mountains, we took our nets and oars and walked toward the sound of water. The sky that morning was a dull gray sheet. The wind came from the north, dry and sharp as a blade. We hauled our small boats over the frozen beach, the wood groaning against the ice. Each step was a test. One wrong movement, one patch of thin ice, and you could vanish into the black below. But hunger has a way of silencing fear. We had families to feed, fires to keep burning, and stories to continue. I remember the feeling when we broke through the thin layer of ice, pushing the boat into open water. The sound, like glass shattering, echoed across the fjord. Our oars dipped into the water, the rhythm slow, steady, ancient. The sea smelled of iron and salt, of something eternal. My father sat at the stern, his beard rimed with frost. He had fished these waters all his life. He said the sea could tell when you were desperate, and that's when she decided whether to give or to take. We didn't speak much. The only sounds were the oars, the creak of wood, and the far-off cries of gulls that never left, no matter the cold. We dropped our lines through holes in the ice where the current was strongest. The bait was simple: small pieces of dried meat, bits of shellfish. We waited. Time passed differently out there, slow, patient, endless. Sometimes the line would twitch, and we'd pull up a writhing cod, its scales shining like silver even in the dim light. Other times, nothing came, and we just sat, breathing mist, watching the horizon blur into the clouds. The sea gave, and the sea took. That day, it gave us more than we'd hoped. By midday, the boat was heavy with fish, cod, haddock, and a few flatfish from the deeper waters. We stored them in wooden barrels lined with salt, packing each layer tightly. The salt was precious, brought from distant lands through trade, so we used it carefully. A single handful could decide whether your food lasted the winter or spoiled before the thaw. On the way back, the wind rose. Waves crashed against the sides of the boat, spraying our faces with icy water. For a moment, it felt as if the sea was testing our worth. My father murmured something under his breath, a prayer maybe, or a warning to the spirits below. He believed there were beings in the water, the half-guffa, the sea mist giant, and the drowned souls of sailors who never found their way home. He said if you stared too long into the waves, you might see their faces looking back. When we reached shore, the village came alive. Children ran toward the boats, their laughter sharp and bright in the cold air. Women hurried to the racks near the smokehouse, preparing to gut and hang the fish. The smell of the sea mixed with smoke and pine, harsh but comforting. That night, the longhouse glowed like a lantern in the dark. Fish stew bubbled in iron pots. Bowls of broth were passed around, steaming in the firelight. It wasn't luxury, but it was warmth, and that was all we needed. As I ate, I listened to the old fishermen telling their tales. They spoke of the deep, of places where no sun ever reached, where creatures glowed like embers in the dark. One man swore he'd seen a serpent larger than his boat rise from the water and vanish again beneath the ice. Another said he once heard singing, soft, distant, beautiful, coming from beneath the waves. He believed it was the ocean itself, calling for him. The sea was full of stories. We grew up hearing them, half afraid, half enchanted. When storms came, we'd say the gods were feasting below, tossing waves like cups of ale. And when the sea grew calm, we knew she was sleeping, dreaming of ships that had once dared to cross her. Fishing wasn't just survival, it was communion. Every time we set sail, we offered something, a small piece of bread, a drop of ale, to the waters. We didn't have temples by the shore. The sea was our temple. It fed us, punished us, and reminded us of our place in the world. As winter deepened, fishing became harder. The ice crept closer to the boats, and the wind howled through the fjord like a living thing. We built small huts near the shore to smoke fish day and night. The smoke clung to our clothes, our hair, even our dreams. But when the barrels were finally full, when the racks were heavy with dried cod, there was a strange peace in the air. The village smelled of salt and fire, the scent of survival. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went outside and stood by the frozen beach. The moon hung low, pale and watchful. The sea murmured under the ice, like a giant breathing in its sleep. And for a moment, I thought I saw something move beneath the surface, a faint shimmer, like light caught in water, gone before I could be sure. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. In the north, we learned not to question what the night showed us, because the cold had a way of bending truth. And the sea always kept her secrets. Still, every time I ate a piece of dried fish that winter, I remembered that shimmer beneath the ice. And I wondered, were we the hunters, or just guests, briefly fed by something much older than us? The sea had given us her bounty. But soon, it would be time to guard it. To preserve it, store it, and make sure it lasted through the months when the world turned white and silent. Because even in a village full of food, hunger was never far behind. And that, was when the true art of survival began. By midwinter, the snow was higher than a man's chest, and the paths between the houses became narrow tunnels of ice. The sea froze almost to the middle of the fjord, trapping boats in white silence. The world outside the walls was a place of ghosts and wolves now, and life moved inward, into the glow of the longhouses, where smoke curled through the rafters and every sound felt hushed by the weight of snow above. That was the time when the art of keeping food alive began. People think survival is about the hunt, about strength and blood. But most of what saved us came from patience, from knowing how to trick time itself. My mother used to say that the gods gave women the greater task, to guard what men had brought home. And it was true. The longhouse was a kind of living storehouse, warm at its heart, cold at its edges, filled with smells of fish, herbs, and smoke. In one corner stood barrels packed with salted meat. The salt glittered faintly when the firelight reached it, a treasure brought from lands so far south that I could barely imagine them. Each barrel was sealed with thick layers of resin and rope. Once closed, they would not be opened until deep winter, when the snow outside would glow blue in the moonlight and the air inside the house grew thin with hunger. Near the hearth, strings of dried fish hung from beams, their shapes black against the smoke. The fish were as hard as wood now. To eat them, we soaked them in warm broth until they softened again. The broth itself came from bones boiled for hours, sometimes days, until every trace of strength had been drawn from them. Nothing in the north was ever wasted. Even the water that had cooled our stew might be used again the next morning. Behind the longhouse was the cold pit, a storage dug deep into the frozen ground. Its entrance was covered with thick planks and a mound of snow. Inside, barrels of pickled vegetables, buckets of fat, and bundles of dried herbs slept through the season. If you stepped into it, your breath turned to mist, and your voice seemed to freeze in midair. But the food lasted. The earth itself kept it safe. My mother would often take me there, a lantern in her hand, the flame shivering in the cold. I remember the sound of frost cracking on the wooden lids as she checked each barrel. She knew them by touch, which one held cabbage, which one turnips, which one the last of the summer berries drowned in honey. I asked her once how she remembered so much. Because forgetting, she said, is how people starve. We kept not only food, but trust in those barrels. Every family guarded their stores like secrets, counting and dividing what they had. Still, there were nights when someone would knock quietly at our door, a neighbor whose own stores had run dry, or a widow with children too small to work. My father never refused. He'd give them a piece of smoked fish, sometimes a little bread. He'd never speak of it after, but my mother's eyes would soften when she watched him. "You feed the hungry today," she'd whisper, "and the gods might feed you tomorrow." The smokehouse outside worked without pause all through the dark months. Thick black smoke rose from it day and night, carrying the scent of birch and pine across the village. Men would stoke the fire, turning the racks of meat and fish to make sure they cured evenly. It was slow work, days of tending, checking, tasting, waiting. And in that waiting, people found a kind of peace. There wasn't much else to do but keep the fires alive and listen to the wind. Sometimes, when the snow fell without end, we'd hear the ice shifting on the fjord. It sounded like a groan, deep and ancient, as if the sea were dreaming under its frozen skin. Inside, we'd huddle closer to the fire. The walls creaked, the wind clawed at the roof, but the smell of food in storage reminded us that we were safe. As long as the barrels were full, as long as smoke rose from the chimney, the winter could rage as much as it pleased. But it wasn't only about meat and fish. There were other, smaller miracles hidden in those stores. Tiny jars of fermented milk, kept near the hearth so they wouldn't freeze solid. Loaves of barley bread baked in autumn, dried to stone hardness, waiting to be softened again in broth. And honey, always a little honey. It didn't spoil, no matter how many years passed. My mother said honey remembered the sun, and when you tasted it, it was like swallowing a piece of summer. Once, when I was a boy, I woke to find her crushing dried berries into a bowl, mixing them with honey and a handful of oats. She shaped the mixture into small cakes and set them near the fire to harden. I asked what they were for. "For journeys," she said. "When the snow melts and you must travel. Sweet food keeps the spirit strong." Those small details, the way she wrapped each cake in cloth, the way she whispered a word of thanks before tasting the broth, they were lessons as real as any battle. They taught me that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about keeping the memory of warmth alive, even when the world outside was made of ice. We didn't have calendars then, but we felt the passing of time in the stores. When the barrels began to empty, we knew that spring was still too far away. When the smokehouse grew quiet, we knew we'd need to ration what was left. And yet, every time the firelight touched the jars and the hanging fish, I felt something like pride. Each piece was proof that we'd worked together, that we'd outsmarted the cold one more time. Sometimes, when the wind dropped low enough, you could hear the sound of dripping, the first melt, the sign that the earth hadn't forgotten us. My mother would smile when she heard it. "The ice is giving back what it borrowed," she'd say. And in that moment, even the darkest night of winter felt a little warmer. But before the snow could melt completely, there was still one ritual left to mark the heart of the cold. The great feast in the longhouse, when the village gathered to share what they had saved, and to remind themselves that no one survived the north alone. That night was more than a meal. It was a promise. By the time the sun rose no higher than a hand above the horizon, we knew it was time. Midwinter, the darkest night, when day and night seemed to become one long shadow. But that was when our hearts burned brightest. The feast was not just celebration. It was defiance. A promise to the gods, and to each other, that we would not yield to the cold. The longhouse was alive before dawn. Smoke curled from the roof holes, orange light spilling into the snow. The men carried barrels inside, shoulders bent beneath the weight. The women stirred great pots over the fire, steam rising thick as fog. The air was heavy with smells, smoke, meat, and that sweet, sharp tang of mead. You could feel the warmth before you even stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath the boots of those who entered. Furs were hung along the benches, and torches flickered against the beams. Children ran between the tables, laughing, their faces red from the cold. In the center, the hearth roared, a pillar of fire that reached toward the rafters. Around it, people gathered with mugs and knives, waiting for the feast to begin. My father stood near the fire, sharpening his blade. It wasn't for battle, it was for carving the meat. When he finished, he ran his thumb along the edge and smiled. "A dull knife is a sin on a night like this," he said. The first dish was always broth, thick, golden, and steaming. It was made from bones that had boiled for 3 days straight, enriched with herbs and bits of dried fish. The smell filled every corner of the hall. The elders were served first, then the rest of us. Each bowl was heavy, each spoonful a comfort. We drank it in silence at first, letting the warmth spread through our chests. Then came the meats, slabs of roasted lamb, smoked pork, and even seal fat, blackened at the edges but rich with flavor. The sound of knives cutting, the laughter between bites, the crackling of the fire, it all blended into one living rhythm. I remember how the grease shone on the faces of men who'd hunted through storms, and how they smiled like children. The fish came next, pulled from the coals where it had been buried in seaweed and salt. Its skin was crisp, its flesh soft and white. My mother sprinkled it with herbs she'd dried months ago. When she saw me watching, she winked. "This," she whispered, "is summer's ghost." Outside, the wind howled against the walls, but no one cared. The mead flowed freely, sweet and golden, tasting of wildflowers and bees. It made the room hum, soft at first, then louder. Soon the old men began to sing. The songs were older than any of us, carried across generations, across seas. Some were about the gods, others about love or loss, or ships that never came home. Their voices rose and fell like waves. Between verses, people told stories, not just of raids and battles, but of harvests, of strange dreams, of creatures seen in the northern lights. Someone spoke of a fox that could speak with the voice of a man. Another claimed that under the ice of the fjord, a serpent slept, waiting for spring to crack its shell. The children leaned closer, eyes wide. I remember an old woman who stood and told the story of the first feast. Before our fathers built these houses, she said, they lived in caves and feared the dark. One winter, when all the fires died, a child found a single coal still glowing. He hid it in his hands and carried it from cave to cave, sharing its warmth. That's why we gather now, to keep the coal alive. She sat down, and the hall fell quiet. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air like stars. For a long moment, everyone simply listened to the silence, the wind outside, and their own breath. Then someone began a new song, softer this time. A song about longing and home. After that came the bread, dark, heavy loaves baked from barley and rye, their crusts cracked with smoke. We dipped them into broth, spread them with butter that had been churned from last summer's cream. Each bite was dense, earthy, and real. Food that made you remember you were alive. At the far end of the table, children passed around dried apples, wrinkled but sweet. Someone opened a small jar of berries preserved in honey, and the smell of summer cut through the smoke. When the honey touched my tongue, I almost forgot that winter still ruled the world outside. Later, when the eating slowed, the games began. Men wrestled in the firelight, laughing, their arms slick with sweat. Women tossed bones to tell fortunes. The old ones watched, smiling, their faces deep with wrinkles and memory. My mother told me that laughter was as important as food on nights like this. It feeds the spirit, she said. And she was right. The hall was alive with it, echoing louder than the storm outside. As the hours passed, people began to drift closer to the fire. Some fell asleep against the benches, their bellies full and faces warm. Others sat talking in low voices. I lay on a pile of furs beside the hearth, watching the sparks climb upward into the rafters. The air smelled of smoke and mead and the faint sweetness of honey. My eyes grew heavy, but I didn't want to sleep. There was something sacred about that warmth, something I didn't want to miss. Then my father's voice broke the stillness. He was speaking softly, almost to himself. This is why we live, he said. Not the raids. Not the glory. This, the fire, the food, the people. I looked at him then, really looked, and I understood. For all their strength and fury, the Vikings' greatest power wasn't the axe or the sword. It was this. The ability to gather in darkness, to make warmth where there was none, to share what little they had and call it abundance. As the feast faded into the long hours before dawn, the snow outside began to fall again, slow, silent, endless. And yet, inside, the fire still burned, and the stories still wove their way through the smoke. No one noticed the first pale light creeping across the horizon. But when it came, it caught the icicles on the eaves and made them shine like glass. The longest night had passed. And though the winter was far from over, something had shifted. The promise had been kept. When I woke, the fire had burned low, nothing left but glowing coals and the faint scent of ash. The feast was over. The laughter that had once filled the longhouse had turned into the slow, heavy breathing of those still sleeping, wrapped in furs, mouths open, dreams fogging the air. The world outside had turned quiet again, that deep, muffled silence that only comes after a snowfall. I rose carefully, my limbs stiff, and stepped over a sleeping man who still clutched a cup in his hand. My boots found the cold earth beneath the rushes, and the first touch of air from outside made my breath catch. The longhouse door creaked when I opened it. Outside, everything was white. Not just white, but endless, a sea of it. The roofs of the houses were half buried under the weight of snow, and the smoke from the chimneys rose in thin blue lines, vanishing into the pale dawn. The sky was the color of bone. I could hear the slow groaning of the ice down by the fjord. My father was already awake. Of course he was. I found him near the edge of the clearing, tightening the strap on his axe. His breath came out in heavy clouds. He nodded when he saw me. "Good," he said. "You're up. The forest won't wait." The forest. Even saying the word made me feel both afraid and alive. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also a mouth, a dark, quiet thing that could swallow men whole. And in the dead of winter, it belonged to no one. We walked without speaking, the snow squeaking beneath our boots. The cold was so sharp that it made the inside of my nose ache. Every sound was amplified: the crunch of snow, the creak of leather, the rasp of our breath. The trees were heavy with frost. Their branches bowed like they were tired of holding the sky. We followed the old path north, the one that led to the frozen river. My father carried his spear across his shoulder, and I held the small sled behind me. The air was still, too still. Even the birds had fallen silent. He stopped suddenly and pointed at the ground. "There," he said. I looked down. Tracks deep, clean, and fresh. The shape of them was wrong for deer, longer, heavier, the claws cutting deep. A bear, maybe. Or something worse. "Too early," my father muttered. "They shouldn't be awake yet." He crouched and brushed snow from the print. The edges glittered faintly in the morning light. He frowned, eyes narrowing. "Frozen river's not far," he said finally. "If it's hungry, it'll be hunting along the banks." We moved slower after that. The air felt heavier, thicker. My hand gripped the sled's rope tighter, and every crack of ice sounded like a warning. When we reached the river, it was a white mirror, smooth and gleaming. Beneath the surface, the current still moved, whispering faintly. My father tested the edge with his spear. The ice held. We crossed. Halfway across, he stopped again. His gaze fixed on something ahead. I followed his eyes, and saw it. A carcass. Frozen solid. A reindeer, by the look of it, torn open from chest to belly. The blood had frozen into dark crystals, glittering like rubies against the snow. No scavenger tracks. No sign of wolves. Just the prints we'd followed, and then nothing. The air was so cold it seemed to hum. "Whatever did this," my father said quietly, "it wasn't hungry. It killed for something else." He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. The forest beyond the river was thick, black, endless. I thought I saw something move between the trees, a flicker, a shadow, too quick to name. My father's hand found my shoulder. "We go back," he said. "Now." We moved fast, but not too fast. Running makes noise, and noise carries far in the cold. When we reached the clearing again, the smoke from the longhouse looked different, thinner, drifting low. I realized how far we'd gone, how far the warmth had been behind us. Inside, the hall was quiet. Only my mother was awake, sitting by the fire, mending a cloak. She looked up when we entered. "Nothing?" she asked. My father didn't answer. He set his spear down, unbuckled his cloak, and sat beside her. The silence stretched. Then he said softly, "There's something wrong in the woods." Her needle paused in midair. What kind of wrong? He didn't reply right away. He just stared into the fire, his jaw tight. The flames painted his face in shifting gold and red. Finally, he said, The kind that doesn't leave tracks coming back. I sat quietly, watching their faces, feeling the cold creep back into my bones. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the door. I thought of the thing that had killed the reindeer, and of how easily that red could have been ours. But as the fire crackled and my mother's hands returned to her stitching, the longhouse began to feel safe again. The smell of smoke and leather and salt filled the air. I told myself that whatever waited in the forest belonged to the forest, and as long as we stayed inside, it could not cross the snow to reach us. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. Later that night, when everyone had gone to sleep, I woke to the sound of the dogs outside. They were howling long, low, desperate howls that rose into the wind and made the hair on my neck stand up. My father was already standing by the door, spear in hand. He looked at me once, then put a finger to his lips. The dogs fell silent. And then, in that silence, something moved against the wall. Slow. Heavy. Breathing. The dogs went quiet all at once, as if something had stolen the sound straight from their throats. The silence that followed was too deep, too perfect, the kind of silence that only comes before something terrible happens. I could hear it then. A slow drag of weight against the wooden wall. The crunch of snow under something heavy. And a breath, long, uneven, too close. My father's hand gripped the shaft of his spear so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The fire behind us had burned low again, throwing long shadows across the room. I wanted to speak, but he shook his head once, eyes never leaving the door. The dogs began to growl. Not barking, growling, low in their chests, their hackles raised. Then one of them yelped, high and sharp, and the sound was cut short as though a hand had clamped over its mouth. My heart hammered so loudly I thought whatever was outside might hear it. My father moved toward the door. Every board in the floor creaked under his boots. He pressed his ear against the wood and stayed like that for what felt like forever. Then he stepped back and whispered, "Bar the entrance." My hands shook as I dragged the heavy beam across the doorway. It groaned into place. The noise seemed too loud, too final. We stood there, listening. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, thud. Something hit the wall. Not hard, not like an attack. More like a testing touch. The longhouse trembled slightly. My mother had woken by now. She didn't scream, didn't ask what was happening. She only rose, quiet as the snow, and began to throw more wood on the fire. Flames rose high again, chasing the dark back toward the walls. And that's when we saw it. Through the smoke hole above the hearth, a shadow moved. Just a flicker, but enough to steal every breath from the room. The shape was massive. Too large to be a wolf, too slow to be a man. It passed over the hole, blotting out the light for the space of a heartbeat. Then it was gone. The wind returned, rattling the door, brushing snow from the roof. The dogs barked once more wild, frightened sounds, and then fled into the night. My father exhaled slowly. "It's moved on," he said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. We didn't sleep. None of us. My mother sat beside the fire, humming under her breath, the same lullaby she used to sing to me as a child. My father stayed by the door, his spear never leaving his hand. I lay awake on the furs, staring at the smoke hole, waiting for the shadow to pass again. It didn't. But I heard it, far off this time, the cracking of branches, the faint echo of something heavy moving through the forest. And then, nothing but the wind. By morning, the world seemed almost normal again. The snow had drifted high against the door, glittering in the new light. My father and I went outside first, our boots sinking deep. The air was clear, so clear it almost hurt to breathe. The dogs were gone. Only blood and fur remained near the fence line. The prints around the longhouse were deep, as long as a man's arm, wide as my chest. The claws had torn into the snow, leaving marks that froze overnight into sharp edges. My father crouched down, examining them. "Not a bear," he said. "Not anything I've seen before." He looked at the woods, his eyes narrow and distant. "It came from the river," he added. "And it'll go back when it's hungry again." We followed the trail until it vanished at the edge of the frozen water. The ice there was broken, shattered, like something enormous had fallen through. The hole was black, deep, and perfectly round. The surface around it steamed faintly. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "Is it alive in there?" I asked. My father didn't answer. He only threw a handful of snow into the hole and watched it vanish without sound. Then he turned back toward the village. "Whatever it is," he said, "it doesn't belong to men." When we returned, the others had gathered outside. They'd seen the prince too, heard the dogs in the night. The old ones whispered that the frost beast had woken, a creature said to live under the rivers, feeding on the warmth of men. A tale, I'd always thought. A warning told to children to keep them from wandering too far from home. But the marks in the snow weren't a tale. The broken ice wasn't a warning. That night, the village held a fire blessing. Every house lit torches and placed them in a ring around the clearing. We poured mead into the snow as an offering, to the gods, to the spirits, to whatever might be listening. My mother stood beside me, her face lit by the glow. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the stories are older than the truth. And sometimes they are the truth." The wind rose again, carrying a low, distant sound, not quite a growl, not quite thunder. It came from the direction of the river. Every head turned. The sound faded, swallowed by the snow. But no one moved. Even after the flames died down, even after people returned to their homes, no one slept easily. Every creak of wood, every sigh of wind felt like a footstep in the dark. And for many nights after that, the dogs never came back. Only silence kept us company, and that hollow feeling that something beneath the ice was listening. The morning after the attack was gray and hollow. The village stirred slowly, shivering under thick blankets and furs. Conversation was muted, eyes often darting toward the forest or the frozen river, as if expecting the shadow to return. The dogs had vanished entirely, leaving only a trail of paw prints leading toward the northern woods, fading beneath fresh snow. I found myself wandering toward the longhouse of the oldest skald in the village, an old man named Hakon, whose voice had once commanded attention in halls far to the south, and whose stories had traveled further than anyone could measure. He was hunched over his table, scraping a piece of wood with a knife, carving runes that smelled of pine resin and smoke. When he saw me, he nodded and gestured for me to sit. I hesitated, the chill still biting at my face and hands. He looked me in the eyes and said simply, "You saw it last night. The forest whispered to you, and the river spoke. You are ready to hear the old story." I swallowed and nodded. Hakon's voice was low, a rasp of wind through dead leaves. "Long ago," he began, "before any of the villages you know, before the longhouses, before even the oldest forests grew thick, the north was a wild place, ruled by gods and spirits alike. Men were small, weak, and foolish. They hunted carelessly, took more than they needed, and forgot to honor the balance. Then, the gods decided to teach them a lesson. They took a great creature from the rivers, one that carried the winter in its blood, the frost in its breath, and the hunger of the mountains in its belly. It was sent to remind men that the north belongs to the cold first, and only second to them." He paused, scratching the runes into the wood, and I could feel the tension in his hands, the weight of generations pressing down through his knuckles. "This beast," he continued, "is not born of flesh alone. It is made of hunger, of the snow itself, and of the spirits of hunters who died before their time. When men break the laws of survival, taking more than they can preserve, leaving the weak to starve. It wakes. It hunts. And it feeds on the warmth of life. I shivered, though the fire burned warmly nearby. I thought of the carcass we had found, the broken ice, the shadow that passed over the smoke hole. Hakon's words tied the events into something larger, something older than the village, older than any of our names. Can it be killed? I asked. The old man chuckled, but it was not a happy sound. Killed? Perhaps. But not by swords or spears alone. Only respect, only offerings, and only careful balance between need and greed will keep it at bay. Feed the earth, honor the dead, preserve the stores, and sometimes it will leave you be. Forget those things, and the frost will come down into your bones, and the beast will answer your weakness with hunger and shadow. I sat in silence for a long while, staring at the runes and trying to understand. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the roof beams, and somewhere far away across the frozen fields, I could swear I heard a faint groan, deep and hollow, like ice cracking beneath the weight of the world. Hakon handed me a small carving, a token of protection. Carry this, he said, and remember, the frost is patient. It does not forget. Neither should you. I left the old skald's house feeling both heavier and lighter at the same time. The story had filled in the gaps between fear and understanding, yet it had also opened a door to the unknown. That night, I looked at the forest differently, the frozen river differently, and even the snow itself seemed to whisper secrets. Back at home, my father spoke little. He had seen the marks in the snow, felt the cold in the air, and knew the forest had shifted somehow. We preserved the stores carefully, added extra layers of salt to the meat, and wrapped bundles of dried fish in furs, just as my mother instructed. Every move felt measured, deliberate, as if the shadow of the unseen watcher hung just beyond the edge of our vision. That night, when the villagers gathered by the hearth for warmth and light, there were no songs, no laughter. Only quiet, the kind that fills the cracks of worry, the kind that allows everyone to listen with the same sense of purpose. The fire glowed, but shadows clung to the corners. We ate quietly, carefully, and each bite tasted heavier than before, flavored with fear, respect, and a strange reverence for survival. I could feel the winter pressing in, not only on the village, but on the heart itself. And I knew that in the north, survival was not about strength alone. It was about knowledge, caution, and remembering the stories that had kept men alive for centuries. The frost beast was not just a creature. It was a teacher, a reminder, and sometimes it was the only thing that would make you careful enough to live. And in the darkness beyond the longhouse, beneath the ice of the river, I swore I heard something stirring, slow, deliberate, and patient. Something that had waited for this night. The dawn came slowly, pale and brittle, filtering through a gray sky that seemed to sag under the weight of snow. The longhouse was quiet. Most of the villagers still slept, curled beneath furs thick enough to keep out the cold, but I couldn't. My mind was heavy with the stories Hakon had told, the tracks we'd seen, and the shadow that had passed over our roof. My father stirred first, as he always did. His movements were careful, precise, boots buckled, cloak fastened, spear in hand. He didn't speak, only gestured for me to follow. The air outside bit at my cheeks and ears, and the snow crunched underfoot like brittle glass. We moved toward the frozen river again, this time not for hunting, but to check the ice and the fish traps we had set weeks before. The river was quiet, unnervingly quiet, and the fog hovered low above the ice like smoke. Every sound carried, a snapping branch, the distant call of a raven, the whisper of wind over frozen water. The prints were still there, deeper than before, cutting a path from the forest to the river and back again. They were jagged, almost claw-like, and led to areas where the ice had broken in irregular patterns. My father frowned, leaning on his spear. "It's still moving," he said softly. "Watching. Learning." We checked the traps first. The nets, submerged beneath the ice, had caught only a few small fish. Not enough to sustain the village if the frost continued. My father squatted, testing the ice near the riverbank with his spear. Thin. Too thin. He tapped it, and the surface shivered like glass vibrating under a storm. "Patience," he muttered. "The river decides when it will give." I shivered, both from cold and unease. Every sense felt heightened. A crow cawed somewhere deep in the forest, and I thought I saw shadows move between the trunks. I forced my gaze back to the river. Survival was not a matter of courage alone. It was attention, careful calculation, and respect for the power beyond our understanding. We moved along the edge of the ice, checking each trap. Every time I looked at the footprints, I felt a pull of unease, as if whatever had made them could appear at any moment. My father didn't speak of it. He simply nodded, adjusted his cloak, and kept moving. When we reached a deeper part of the river, the current hummed beneath the ice. We dropped the nets here, weighted with stones, hoping to catch cod or perch that thrived in colder waters. My hands were numb, and the cold burned as I tied knots in the ropes. My father's fingers moved with efficiency born of years. Each movement deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling sound beneath the ice. Not a crack, not a break, a vibration, subtle but deliberate. I froze. My father paused, his eyes narrowing. He placed a hand on my shoulder, pressing me down against the ice. "Do not move," he whispered. The sound passed slowly, like a wave rolling under the frozen surface. The ice groaned faintly, and the prints on the riverbank seemed to shift, though I knew they were frozen solid. The wind carried a faint scent of iron and snow, not blood, but something older, harsher, wild. We continued our work, slower now, careful not to make noise. Every step, every movement, seemed to echo too loudly in the frozen silence. The traps were checked, the nets set, and we began the slow journey back to the village, each footstep deliberate, every glance toward the forest cautious. When we reached the longhouse, the sun had risen just enough to make the snow glitter. Inside, the villagers were stirring, talking quietly, the smoke curling from the chimney. Life continued, even as the shadow of the frost beast lingered beyond the trees. My father and I shared a quiet meal, dried fish, a little barley bread, and honey. Every bite tasted of tension and survival, of winter and fear. He spoke softly, more to himself than me. "The frost will teach them, as it has taught us. Always remember, the North is patient. It watches, it waits. It feeds on the careless and spares the careful." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into my bones. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves, the forest remained silent, and the river hummed beneath its frozen skin. The day stretched on, cold and gray, and I knew that every step we took, every fish we caught, every log we chopped for the fire was a quiet defiance against a force far older than any man, any story, or any village. And I also knew with an uneasy certainty that the frost beast had not forgotten us. Evening fell like a heavy curtain, folding the village into shadow. The cold outside pressed against the longhouse walls, making the air inside feel warmer, but also tighter, more alive. My father and I prepared the evening meal with deliberate care, every movement steady, almost ritualistic. The wind rattled the eaves, and I could hear the distant groan of the ice across the fjord, a reminder that the frost beast had not vanished, only withdrawn to watch. My father carried out the first task, checking the hidden caches where we kept the winter stores. He moved silently, lifting lids and inspecting barrels, running his hands over the salted meat and dried fish. Each bundle of furs around the barrels was carefully adjusted. My mother had instructed him to weave small charms, carved wooden symbols, bits of iron, and dried herbs, into the layers. These were not decorations. They were protection. "Every creature has its fear," my father whispered as he worked. "Even beasts of shadow and frost. These will make it hesitate." I followed, placing sprigs of juniper and dried moss into the folds of meat sacks and barrels. Hakon's words about balance and respect echoed in my mind. These rituals weren't just superstition. They were part of understanding the North, of surviving it. Each act of care, each offering to the spirits and the frost, was a thread in the fragile web of life we were weaving. After the stores were secured, we moved to the hearth. The fire had burned low, and the room smelled faintly of smoke, dried fish, and resin. My father set out small bowls of mead and honey. "For the spirits," he said, tipping a spoonful into the flames, letting the liquid hiss and steam. The smell changed, sharp and sweet, curling upward as if carried by invisible hands. I added my own offering, a handful of dried berries, and watched the smoke rise. For a moment, I imagined the frost beast, somewhere beneath the ice, inhaling the scent, considering the gesture. Respect, care, attention. Perhaps that was what could keep us safe, more than any spear or trap. The villagers began to gather near the hearth as the meal was set. My father whispered instructions to each family, outlining small acts they must perform that night. Tying bundles of herbs above doorways, sprinkling salt in thresholds, and whispering words of caution to ward off the frost. It was a ceremony both solemn and ordinary, blending survival with superstition. As the meal was served, thick fish stew, slices of smoked meat, dense barley bread, and a little honey, the village settled into quiet murmurs. The children, sensing the gravity of the night, ate slowly, listening to the adults discuss the prints in the snow and the broken ice at the river. Stories were told again, in hushed voices, not as entertainment but as instruction. Tales of the frost beast, of spirits beneath the river, and of men who vanished when they ignored the rules of winter. The firelight danced across faces lined with frost and worry. My father spoke softly about balance and caution, about the respect the North demands. He reminded the village that survival was not measured in courage alone, but in awareness, in preparation, and in the quiet acts of care that many overlooked. Later, when the meal was finished, my father led me outside to check the perimeter. Torches had been placed around the village, casting long shadows into the forest. Every corner was scrutinized. We listened to the wind, the ice, the faint cracking of branches, and even the subtle shifts in snow. The frost beast might not appear tonight, but its presence was a lesson: patience, observation, and respect. Before we returned to the longhouse, my father dug a small pit near the frozen riverbank. He placed an offering there, bits of salted meat, dried fish, and a small carved figure of protection. "We give thanks," he said, "and we remind it. We are careful, we are alive, we are patient. The North rewards the wise." As we walked back, the village behind us glowed softly from torchlight, smoke curling skyward, faint echoes of murmured prayers and whispered warnings floating in the cold air. Even in darkness, even in winter's deepest grip, there was a rhythm, a pulse of life, a quiet defiance against the shadow that roamed the forest and river. That night, when I finally lay down, the wind rose again, gusting over the longhouse and across the frozen fields. The frost beast was out there, somewhere, beneath the ice and snow. But for the first time, I felt a measure of understanding. Not fear, but vigilance. Not ignorance, but respect. And the North, patient as ever, waited. The next morning was sharper than any I had known. The wind sliced through layers of furs and cloaks, and snow drifted in small ghostly waves across the village. The sky was a pale gray, pressed low as if it could touch the treetops. My father and I set out before the villagers stirred, carrying woven baskets and small knives for harvesting roots and herbs hidden beneath the frozen soil. The forest greeted us with silence, thick and watchful. Trees, heavy with frost, loomed like ancient guardians. Every branch seemed poised to move, every shadow seemed alive. The footprints from the previous days had disappeared under fresh snow, leaving only a perfect, untouched white canvas, except for tiny, deliberate disturbances. A branch bent slightly in a way that suggested weight far heavier than a man. A faint crunch where the snow had been compressed unevenly. These subtle hints told me the frost beast had been near, its presence lingering even when unseen. We moved carefully, testing the frozen ground before stepping. My father paused often, kneeling to examine the soil, the frost, and the patterns left by small animals. "The forest speaks," he said. "If you listen, you learn where danger lies and where life hides." We reached a patch where the earth was soft enough for digging. Beneath the thin crust of snow were roots and herbs, stores of summer and autumn hidden from the cold. My father dug first, breaking the frost with careful strikes of his knife. He unearthed thick, knobby roots, their smell earthy and bitter. I followed, collecting smaller ones, placing them in the basket alongside sprigs of juniper, moss, and wintergreen. Each plant was more than food. Each carried a purpose, for flavor, for healing, and for ritual protection against the unseen forces of winter. As we worked, I noticed the subtle signs of movement in the forest. Broken branches just out of reach, the faint shimmer of fur in a shadow, the eerie silence where even birds dared not sing. My father didn't acknowledge them, but I knew he felt them. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned constantly, measuring, calculating, watching for the smallest clue. I remembered Hakon's story of the frost beast and its origins, a creature of hunger and winter, a reminder of man's place in the north. The prints, the broken ice, the shadow over the smoke hole, these were its marks, evidence of patience and awareness beyond human comprehension. And now, among the trees and snow, I began to understand that survival meant more than stored food or fire. It required constant vigilance, observation, and respect. My father motioned toward a clearing ahead. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, almost like the tang of iron, and I stiffened. We moved slowly, keeping low, our baskets ready but our hands free. In the center of the clearing, snow had been disturbed in a perfect circle. The edges were clean, as if something massive had pressed down, but no tracks led away from it. My father studied it quietly, then whispered, "It's learning. Watching how we move, what we take, what we leave." We harvested quickly from that clearing, choosing only what we needed. Every action was deliberate. Every movement measured. The forest was alive around us, patient, waiting. The frost beast was not here, not physically, but its presence was unmistakable. A reminder that the North was a living force, indifferent and relentless, and that we were merely passing through its domain. As we began our walk back to the village, I glanced behind at the trees. Shadows shifted, too large to be deer, too fleeting to be human. My father's hand rested on my shoulder, steadying me, silent acknowledgement of the truth we both felt. The forest, the river, the snow, and the frost, all watched, all judged, and all remembered. When we reached the village, the sun was a pale disk barely above the horizon. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and villagers moved quietly, checking stores and preparing for another day under the heavy weight of winter. I carried the herbs and roots, feeling their significance not just as food, but as talismans, as lessons, as lifelines in a world ruled by patience, frost, and the unseen. Evening would come again, and with it, new rituals, new offerings, and new lessons about fear, respect, and survival. The frost beast would remain unseen, yet ever present, its silent gaze embedded in every shadow, in every creaking branch, and in every step across the snow. And I understood, with a weight settling deep in my chest, that to survive the North was to live in constant awareness, to honor the balance between life and winter, hunger and patience, man and beast. By late afternoon, the forest had taken on a deeper gray, the pale light filtering through the frost-covered branches in thin, trembling shafts. My father and I returned to the longhouse, our baskets filled with roots, herbs, and moss, the harvest heavy with both sustenance and significance. But as we stepped into the clearing, I felt it again, that prickling sense of being watched. We were not alone. The snow around the longhouse bore subtle disturbances, small depressions, broken twigs, tufts of fur caught in branches. Nothing large, nothing immediate, yet every detail spoke to patience and observation. The frost beast, or whatever lingered in the forest, had been near. I pointed to the tracks, and my father nodded once, eyes narrowing. "Close," he said. "Too close for comfort." Inside, my mother had already begun preparing the roots we had collected. She boiled them in large pots over the hearth, mixing them with dried fish, salted meat, and herbs. The smells were heady, earthy, smoky, sharp with pine and juniper. Every stir of the spoon was deliberate. Every bundle of herbs added carried not just flavor, but protection, as old customs dictated. My father and I worked alongside her, slicing, chopping, and distributing the harvest into portions for immediate cooking and ritual use. My father whispered instructions: which herbs to place near the fire, which to hide in corners, which to lay beneath the sleeper's furs. Every act was a thread in the web of survival, a defense woven with tradition and careful observation. The wind rose outside, rattling the roof and walls. The longhouse seemed to shrink beneath its roar, and shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor. My mother paused, glancing toward the smoke hole. "It's near," she said softly, almost to herself. I followed her gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a fleeting shadow sliding between the trees. Not a man, not an animal I recognized. Just a shape, fluid and deliberate, watching. My father froze, listening to the wind. He said nothing, but I could feel the tension in the room rise, binding us to a single shared awareness. The meal that evening was quiet. Thick root stew, smoked fish, barley bread, and honey were shared, each bite a reminder that survival was never certain, that the North demanded respect, patience, and caution. Words were minimal, for speech seemed fragile against the weight of the wind and the presence lurking outside. Afterward, my father led me outside again to inspect the perimeter. Torches glowed in the snow, small circles of protection around the longhouse. The footprints were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A shift of snow here, a bent twig there, but they were unmistakable. The creature had moved close, observed, but not yet dared the fire or the circle. Its patience was its power. My father's hand rested on my shoulder as we walked the perimeter. "It tests us," he said. "It learns. The North teaches through patience, through fear. We must not be careless." Returning inside, the longhouse felt fragile yet resilient, a small island of warmth and light in a vast, silent winter. The frost beast remained outside, a presence defined not by what we could see, but by what we could sense, by the subtle marks of its patience, by the weight of its observation, and by the careful rituals we performed to maintain balance. That night, sleep was uneasy. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind, every shifting shadow drew my attention. The lessons of survival were clear. Vigilance, respect, and ritual were not merely tradition. They were necessity. And in the shadows beyond the light of the hearth, I could feel it waiting. Patient. Watching. Learning. Night fell slowly, dragging shadows across the village. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the sharp scent of snow, ice, and the river's hidden currents. Inside the longhouse, the fire burned low, casting flickering light on walls lined with furs, herbs, and the carefully prepared stores of food. Every corner seemed to hold a shadow, every shifting ember a shape waiting to move. I lay on a pile of furs, the roots and herbs from our morning harvest stacked nearby. Sleep was elusive. Every creak of the timber, every gust of wind, every soft thud from outside made my chest tighten. I could hear the subtle sounds of the village at rest, the low breathing of the sleeping, the distant rustle of furs as someone turned in their sleep, the occasional soft snore, and yet nothing felt safe. The presence in the forest was patient, but it was there, and that knowledge weighed more than any cold. My father moved through the longhouse, quietly checking the torches and the small charms placed at thresholds and over windows. Each ritual act was deliberate, sprinkling salt, touching the carvings, whispering words my mother had taught him to strengthen the wards. He paused near my side, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Listen," he whispered. I strained my ears. At first, there was only the wind, the occasional pop of the fire. Then faintly, almost imperceptibly, I heard it, a soft scraping, a deliberate step across packed snow outside. A branch snapping lightly. Something moving, slow and deliberate, testing boundaries, staying just beyond reach. The village dogs had not returned. Their absence was another reminder. The frost beast did not act like other predators. It did not rush, it did not flee, it waited. And it watched. Hours passed like this. I stayed awake, muscles tensed, senses sharpened. My father's occasional adjustments to the charms and wards felt like countermeasures in a game played long before our time. Every gesture carried weight, every pause, meaning. The forest beyond the walls seemed to lean in, and the distant river groaned beneath its ice, a reminder of life flowing unseen, hidden, powerful. At one point, I swore I saw movement in the firelight through a window, a flicker of dark fur, a shadow of claws, a silhouette that vanished before I could be certain. My father caught my gaze and nodded once. He didn't speak, because words could not name the danger. Only awareness and respect could suffice. As the hours crawled forward, I felt myself pulled into the rhythm of the night. Every sound, every breath, every shadow was a lesson. Fear was not weakness here, it was instruction. Vigilance was survival. Understanding the limits, observing the forest, respecting its patience, that was what kept us alive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wind softened. The scraping ceased. The ice groaned one last time. The forest seemed to exhale, a quiet lull that suggested the beast had retreated, at least for now. My father crouched beside me. "It waits," he said. "Always. But tonight, it has learned caution. And so must we." Even as I finally let my eyes close, the fire's glow reflecting on the frozen window panes, I knew the lessons of the night would follow me. The frost beast, patient and silent, had reminded us that in the north, survival was not about strength alone, but about observation, ritual, and respect. And somewhere beyond the walls of the longhouse, beneath the snow and ice, something waited, slow, deliberate, and patient, shaping the night around us, a shadow that had taught me that fear, when understood, could become a guide. Dawn broke pale and thin, the gray sky barely illuminating the snow-covered village. A faint light reflected off the ice, giving the world an eerie shimmer. My father and I prepared once more to venture out, baskets and tools in hand, for the long winter demanded constant vigilance. Each day was a lesson, each step outside a negotiation with the frost and the unseen forces that stalked the north. The village moved slowly. Some of the older men followed us for the morning checks, carrying extra spears and small bundles of protection charms. Even the children, peeking from behind doorways, understood that the forest beyond held more than cold. It held patience, hunger, and a quiet intelligence that could not be ignored. We walked along the riverbank first, checking the fish traps we had set before. Ice creaked underfoot, thin in some spots, thicker in others. My father tested it constantly, spear in hand, eyes scanning the banks and distant trees. The traps had caught more fish this time, cod and perch, but there were disturbances. The frozen blocks of ice around them were scratched, chipped, as if something large had moved beneath the surface. "Not a man, not a bear," my father murmured, studying the marks. "Something else." I shivered, both from the cold and from the knowledge in his voice. The frost beast's presence was growing bolder. Tracks that had once been tentative now pressed closer to our work, circling the traps, testing the edges of our defenses. The shadows of the trees themselves seemed to stretch toward us, heavy with observation. We moved carefully toward the forest edge, where hidden caches of stored meat and preserved roots waited. My father checked each bundle, adjusting coverings and adding small charms. The frost had begun to form unevenly across the snow, signs that something heavy had passed during the night. My father studied each mark in silence. "It is learning," he said finally, voice low. "Watching how we take, how we move, how we care. It understands the balance." As we worked, I noticed subtle signs of movement: broken twigs, fur snagged in branches, small depressions in the snow that vanished when we approached. Nothing immediate, nothing overt, just hints, whispers, reminders that we were never truly alone. Each sound and shift heightened my awareness. Every step became deliberate, every gesture measured. By midday, we had secured the traps and checked the caches. The baskets of roots and herbs from yesterday were distributed, with some laid out near the fire and others hidden in protective corners. Every bundle carried meaning, not just nourishment but security, an offering to keep the unseen watcher at bay. Returning to the village, we noticed the other families beginning their preparations. Torches were checked, wards and charms renewed, and everyone moved with the rhythm of survival, a quiet understanding that the North demanded respect, patience, and vigilance. Conversations were muted, eyes frequently scanning the forest and river, anticipating signs of movement. That evening, as the sky darkened and wind rose again, I watched the shadows in the snow. Something had passed near the longhouse, faint, deliberate disturbances in the fresh layer of powder. The frost beast was closer than ever, testing boundaries, learning our routines. And yet, for all its power, it had not crossed into the village. Back inside the warmth of the longhouse, my father and I prepared for the night watches. Torches were adjusted, charms checked, and offerings refreshed. Every ritual, every precaution, was a small battle against fear, a defense not just of the body, but of mind and spirit. The forest outside seemed to lean toward the village, patient and silent, every sound amplified in the frozen air. Somewhere beneath the ice and snow, the frost beast observed, waited, and learned. And in that awareness, I began to understand that survival in the North was not just about fire or food, but about attention, respect, and the unspoken agreement between man and the patient, eternal wilderness. Night arrived like a heavy gray curtain, muffling sound and blurring shapes. The village was quiet, save for the crackling of fires and the occasional murmur of those still awake, tending to their torches and charms. My father and I prepared for our patrols, stepping into the cold with baskets of herbs, small offerings, and sharpened spears. Every movement was precise, deliberate, an unspoken acknowledgement that the forest watched, and that the unseen presence was patient. The snow crunched under our boots, sharp in the still air. We followed the river first, the ice reflecting dim torchlight in fractured, trembling patterns. Something large had passed here during the day, branches bent in impossible ways, snow pressed flat as though by weight far heavier than a man. My father's hand rested on my shoulder. "It tests us," he whispered. "Always." We stopped to inspect the traps again. Ice had shifted, small cracks fanning out like frost-riven spiderwebs. Fish stirred beneath the frozen surface, but some traps had been disturbed. Not stolen, just moved, nudged, tested. It was deliberate. Someone or something was learning our methods, adjusting its behavior to ours. Moving into the forest, we took smaller, careful steps. Every sound seemed amplified, The scrape of a branch, the soft scuff of snow, the distant moan of the river beneath ice. I imagined eyes in the darkness, glowing faintly, following our progress. We had been careful, patient, respectful. Yet the subtle disturbances suggested we were not unseen. My father knelt at a depression in the snow. The marks were huge, much larger than any wolf or bear, the depth telling of immense weight. "Closer," he said, voice low. Testing the perimeter, learning the pattern of our nights. We laid small offerings in the clearing, dried meat, herbs, juniper, and protective carvings. These rituals were no longer just about tradition, they were strategy. A silent conversation with the unseen watcher, telling it that we respected its presence, but that the village would not be taken lightly. Hours passed. The wind rose, whistling through the trees, carrying the faint scent of something wild and metallic. From somewhere deep beneath the ice, I heard a slow groaning, like the river itself was shifting to accommodate a massive form. The hair on my arms stood straight. My father didn't flinch. He merely adjusted the torches, whispered protective words over the offerings, and continued his survey. At one point, a shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. I froze, barely daring to breathe. It was too large for any animal I knew, too deliberate for chance. It paused, as if weighing whether to approach or retreat, then vanished into the forest with quiet efficiency. My father's eyes followed its movement, and he spoke softly. "Patience. We do not chase. We observe. We respect. The North rewards those who understand that." We returned to the village just before the fire burned out completely, the longhouse a small island of warmth and light in the vast gray. Inside, my mother and neighbors checked charms, refreshed offerings, and whispered prayers. The tension was almost tangible, binding us together, sharpening our senses, teaching the village the rhythms of survival in the presence of a patient predator. Lying on my furs that night, I felt the forest pressing in, alive with observation. Every crack of ice, every bend of a branch, every shifting shadow was a reminder. The frost beast waited, not with immediate violence, but with methodical intelligence. It taught lessons in patience, vigilance, and respect. And for the first time, I understood that fear, guided and disciplined, could be a tool as powerful as any weapon. Outside, the wind whispered, carrying faint, deliberate sounds from the forest and river. Somewhere beneath the ice, something immense moved slowly, learning us as much as we learned it. And for the first time, I felt the weight of the North in a new way, not as mere cold or threat, but as a living, conscious force, eternal and unyielding, shaping every breath, every movement, every decision. Morning arrived with an almost oppressive stillness. The wind had died down to a faint whisper, but the snow lay thick and heavy over the village and surrounding forest. My father and I stepped outside, careful not to disturb the fresh layer that might conceal signs of the night's movements. The light was pale, muted, casting long gray shadows across the snow. The first thing we noticed was the traps. Some had been shifted, others partially buried by drifting snow, as if the frost beast had inspected them and left its marks deliberately. The ice around them bore deep scratches, long deliberate lines, too consistent to be random. It had been close, closer than ever before. My father examined the edges, running his fingers over the grooves, nodding in understanding. "It learns," he said. "Patience and observation. It tests, it adapts." I shivered. The thought of such a massive creature moving silently, observing every action, filled me with both fear and respect. Survival in these lands was more than food, fire, or tools. It was about understanding the rhythm of life and death, the invisible rules dictated by the North and the creatures that inhabited it. We began the careful work of resetting the traps, reinforcing the ice, and redistributing the bait. Every movement was deliberate, every step measured. I noticed subtle changes. small depressions in snow, a broken twig here, an uneven frost pattern there. Signs that the beast had circled and perhaps even followed us back toward the village before retreating into the trees. Once the traps were secure, we returned to the longhouse to inspect hidden caches and perform the morning rituals. My father distributed small offerings, dried meat, herbs, and juniper, into the corners of the storerooms and under the furs of sleeping villagers. Each gesture was a message. We respect the forest. We honor the balance. We do not take more than we need. Outside, the village began to stir. Neighbors emerged cautiously, eyes scanning the forest edge and the river. Conversations were hushed, full of tension and quiet observation. Everyone moved with the unspoken understanding that the unseen presence outside was patient, intelligent, and aware of every misstep. We prepared the meal with equal care. Roots and herbs from our recent harvests were boiled with salted fish and preserved meat, creating a thick, sustaining stew. My father reminded me that each ingredient had a purpose: nourishment, protection, and respect for the North's cycles. Even cooking became a ritual, a connection between survival and the lessons of the land. By midday, we ventured back toward the forest to check the perimeter and ensure no new disturbances threatened the village. The tracks from the previous night were more pronounced, the snow compacted into deep grooves, the branches broken in patterns that suggested careful, deliberate passage. The creature was close, observing, learning our routines. My father moved silently, almost blending with the trees, checking the snow, listening to the subtle shifts in wind and ice. I followed, carrying offerings and helping where I could, acutely aware of every sound and shadow. We were not hunters. We were students of the North, trying to read its lessons while respecting the presence that imposed them. Returning to the village, the sun cast a faint golden glow on the snow. It was deceptively calm. The air was heavy with anticipation. No one spoke of fear, but it hovered over the village like a silent companion. Every movement, every preparation, every ritual was a part of the delicate balance that allowed us to exist in the North, a balance that the frost beast tested and reinforced in ways subtle yet unyielding. That evening, torches were placed, charms checked, and offerings renewed. My father and I performed our rounds in near silence, understanding that the night ahead would bring new lessons, new signs, and perhaps new challenges. The presence outside, patient and relentless, had taught us one undeniable truth: in the North, survival is not given. It is earned through vigilance, respect, and the constant recognition of forces far older and wiser than any man. Night descended with a sharp, biting wind, rattling the roofs and carrying the scent of ice and distant pine. Inside the longhouse, the fire burned steadily, but its warmth could not erase the tension that gripped the village. My father and I prepared for our patrols, this time more alert than ever. The events of the past days had shifted the rhythm of survival. The frost beast's presence was no longer distant or subtle. It was close, probing, testing the limits of our defenses. We stepped into the snow, torches flickering in the gray night. The river murmured beneath the ice, groaning with its secret movements. Already, the traps we had reinforced earlier were disturbed again. One net was shredded, its contents gone, and the ice around it bore deep, deliberate scratches. Another trap had been partially overturned, heavy marks in the snow leading toward the forest edge before vanishing into the darkness. "It grows bolder," my father murmured, voice low, almost a whisper of reverence and warning. Patience, yes, but now testing courage as well. We moved slowly along the perimeter, noting every detail. Broken branches, tufts of fur caught in the trees, and indentations in the snow far larger than any human or bear could make. Each mark was deliberate, calculated, a statement that the frost beast was aware of us, observing every pattern, learning our routines, measuring the village. In the forest, the shadows deepened. Every movement of a branch, every snap of frost, seemed amplified in the stillness. I imagined enormous eyes tracking us, a hulking figure hidden just beyond sight, calculating the right moment to approach. My father placed small offerings along the path: meat, herbs, carved wooden symbols, each an act of negotiation with a presence that lingered. The wind shifted, and I caught the faintest metallic tang in the air, sharp and alien, unlike any natural scent. My father paused, pressing a hand to my shoulder. "It is close," he said, tone steady but grave. "Not for hunting, for testing. Tonight it decides how we respond." We continued to inspect the traps and caches, reinforcing every bundle, every hiding spot. Each precaution was a ritual, blending survival with respect. The village depended not only on food and fire, but on understanding the rhythms of the north and the intelligence of the unseen predator. As we circled back toward the longhouse, we noticed the first overt signs of aggression. A small fence protecting the storeroom had been bent outward, as if something had tested its strength. Snow had been scuffed, marking a clear approach to the heart of the village, though nothing had entered. The message was clear: the frost beast could reach us, and it was deciding whether we were strong enough to deter it. Back inside, the villagers had reinforced their homes and charms, sensing the same tension that gripped my father and me. We renewed offerings, whispered words of respect and caution, and prepared for the long night ahead. The creature had escalated its interest, its patience now mingled with calculated curiosity. Perhaps the closest the North's shadow had come to challenging the village directly. I lay on my furs that night, listening to the wind, the river, and the faint disturbances outside. The lessons of fear, respect, and vigilance were sharper than ever. The frost beast had moved from observation to subtle confrontation. Its intelligence, patience, and power were undeniable. Survival was no longer merely about endurance. It was about anticipation, understanding, and the careful balance between courage and caution. Outside, beneath the frozen river and the dense forest, the frost beast waited, calculating, learning. Inside, the village clung to warmth, fire, and ritual, every gesture a silent pact with the North: respect, patience, and vigilance. And in that tense night, I understood fully that the North would not forgive carelessness, and that survival required more than strength, it demanded wisdom. The morning light was muted, pale against the endless expanse of snow. The village lay quiet, save for the distant murmur of the frozen river and the occasional crackle of ice under the weight of snow. My father and I moved quickly, yet carefully, checking every corner, every trap, every cache. Last night had shown us that the frost beast was no longer content to merely observe. Its subtle tests had grown bolder, and we needed to prepare for what was to come. We began by reinforcing the longhouse and the storerooms. Fences were braced with extra logs, gaps in walls filled with snow and moss, and every door was examined to ensure it closed tightly. My father handed me small bundles of herbs and iron charms to place at thresholds, over windows, and above doorways. Each placement was deliberate, a silent conversation with forces beyond human understanding. "The North teaches through patience," he said quietly, "and now it demands attention. Every small act matters." The villagers joined in. Neighbors who had previously focused on daily survival now participated in fortifying their homes. Smoke from fires curled in the cold air, mixing with the scent of pine and frost. Small offerings of meat, herbs, and carved symbols were laid near entrances, over sleeping areas, and in corners where shadows gathered. Each gesture was both a plea and a warning, a respect for the unseen intelligence that moved outside the village. Next, we returned to the traps along the river and the forest edge. The frost beast had left more obvious signs overnight: deep scratches on the ice, broken branches arranged almost deliberately, and impressions in the snow suggesting the weight and size of something immense. It was studying us, learning not just our routines but our precautions, adapting its strategy. We repaired the traps, adjusting nets and lines with care. Every bait was placed with intention, every knot tied firmly, every corner reinforced. I could feel the presence of the beast as we worked, a constant, silent tension in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. By midday, we moved back to the village with baskets of roots, herbs, and preserved meat. The preparations continued, stew thickened over the fire, barley bread baked, and small rituals performed to strengthen protection charms. My father whispered instructions to families, teaching them subtle signs to watch for, ways to move quietly, and gestures that might honor the presence outside while keeping it at bay. As afternoon waned, I noticed shadows in the snow, fleeting but deliberate, that didn't match any human or animal form. The frost beast was closer than ever. It wasn't attacking, not yet, but the intelligence behind these signs was undeniable. It was testing boundaries, observing behavior, understanding how we lived, and perhaps calculating when patience would give way to action. The villagers sensed it too. Eyes flickered to the tree line, to the frozen river, to every sound that broke the stillness. Even the children moved with unusual care, mimicking the vigilance of adults, learning to read the rhythm of fear and respect that defined life in the north. By evening, the longhouse and village were as fortified as we could make them, offerings renewed, charms adjusted, torches lit. My father and I walked the perimeter once more, silent except for the occasional note to adjust a bundle of herbs or check a trap. The wind carried the faint groan of ice and the distant whisper of forest shadows. Somewhere out there, the frost beast watched, calculated, and waited. Lying on my furs that night, I understood more deeply than ever the fragile balance of survival here. The North demanded vigilance, patience, and respect. The unseen watcher had made its presence undeniable, and the lessons of fear, observation, and ritual were now absolute. Every movement mattered, every sound was a message, and every act of care was a shield against the patient, deliberate force outside. And as the wind rose and shadows lengthened, I realized that the frost beast's observation was no longer a distant test. It was a looming presence, a measure of our readiness, and a reminder that in the north, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned, moment by moment, through attention, respect, and unyielding vigilance. The night descended with a bitter sharpness, the wind tearing through the trees and carrying the scent of ice and frost. Inside the village, torches flickered weakly against the growing darkness, their light bending against walls lined with furs, herbs, and carefully stored provisions. The longhouse seemed smaller than usual, a fragile island of warmth and protection amidst the relentless north. My father and I set out for the perimeter once more, the patrols now feeling less routine and more like a ritual of survival. Every step in the snow was measured, every glance toward the forest deliberate. The frost beast had escalated its presence. Subtle movements in previous nights had become more pronounced. Now, evidence of its activity was unmistakable. Larger marks in the snow, deep gouges along tree trunks, broken branches arranged almost deliberately, and faint impressions suggesting weight and size beyond any animal we knew. We approached the traps along the river with heightened caution. One net had been torn apart entirely, another dragged partially toward the trees. Ice around the traps was cracked in long, deliberate lines, suggesting immense strength applied carefully, testing boundaries rather than indiscriminately destroying. My father studied each mark, silent but tense. "It's learning our limits," he whispered. "Testing how we react, seeing where our courage ends and caution begins." I shivered. The presence outside was not mindless or purely instinctive. It was deliberate, intelligent, calculating. Every disturbance, every mark, every shifted branch was a message, a probe into our understanding and preparedness. We replaced the traps with care, reinforcing them with extra ropes and weights, positioning offerings near them, dried meat, herbs, and iron charms, as both appeasement and warning. The forest itself seemed to lean closer, alive with observation. Snowflakes swirled like fine ash around the trees, carrying the faint sound of shifting ice and breaking branches. I imagined eyes glowing faintly from the shadows, tracking every movement, measuring every gesture. My father's steady hand on my shoulder reminded me that courage alone was meaningless without respect and vigilance. We continued around the village, checking the perimeter and reinforcing defensive charms. The wind whispered between the longhouses, carrying distant groans of ice and subtle deliberate shifts in the snow. Each sound heightened our awareness. Even the dogs, restless and growling in their kennels, seemed to sense the growing boldness of the unseen watcher. Returning to the longhouse, we found the villagers quietly maintaining their wards. Families moved silently, checking offerings and adjusting protective bundles of herbs and carvings over doors and windows. Even the children, alert despite fatigue, mimicked the rituals, learning the patterns of survival, when to watch, when to speak softly, when to remain still. As the fire burned low, my father and I performed a final check around the longhouse. The shadows seemed denser, the sound sharper, the air heavier. The frost beast had drawn closer, testing boundaries with a deliberate and careful patience. Its presence was a reminder that the north was never idle, that the wilderness was both teacher and adversary, and that survival depended on understanding, respect, and unyielding vigilance. Lying on my furs that night, the lessons of fear and patience settled deep into me. Each creak of timber, each whisper of wind, each subtle movement in the snow was part of a silent dialogue between the village and the presence outside. And somewhere beyond the light of torches and fire, beneath the ice and shadows, the frost beast waited, patient and calculating, preparing its next lesson, its next test of the fragile balance between life and the relentless north.